Welcome back. I'm Professor David Holden. I'm a military historian and a veteran. All these views are my own and in no way represent the U.S. Army. So today we're going to talk about communism, socialism, and a bit about the Swedish model and what that really is, because you hear a lot about that in the news. So let me tell you a story. Shortly after my divorce, actually it was about a year or two afterwards, my best friend, who's a progressive, gave me some dating advice. And he said, you should try out some of these dating apps. Because I was telling him, I just haven't really ran into anybody anywhere. So I took him up on it, made a profile on a app that shall not go named. Twitter? No. Tinder. It was Tinder. Now, I came across this beautiful profile, very attractive woman. So I hit her up, we matched, and so I asked her out on a date. Now, I picked her up, and about 5 minutes into this date, I just wanted out. We had nothing in common. She swore like a sailor. I mean, I grew up in the military. It's not like I've got virgin ears. But this was taken to a whole nother level. It was like, man, I don't want this person around my kids. And then I realized as we were discussing things, there really wasn't a whole lot going on upstairs. She was beautiful. And I just wanted out of this date as fast as I possibly could. See, socialism is a lot like that. From the outside, it looks beautiful. It looks wonderful. It looks like heaven on earth. But in reality, it's hell on earth. And I'm going to tell you why. And before everyone starts citing the Swedish model, which I'm going to get to, first we're going to look at what is communism, what is socialism, what is the difference, and then we'll get to the whole Swedish model. Thomas Sowell, one of my favorite historians, philosophers, and economists, wrote a book called A Conflict of Visions. And in it, he lays out the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. And what he's really talking about, and this is important to understand because it really gets down to some of the ideological divides that we see here in America. And it really comes down to your understanding of human nature and what's possible. So in the unconstrained vision, you believe that man is inherently flawed. For example, Alexander Hamilton states it this way: "It is the lot of all human institutions, even those of the most perfect kind, to have defects as well as excellencies, ill as well as good propensities. This results from the imperfection of the institutor, man." Edmund Burke put it this way: "We cannot change the nature of things and of men, but must act upon them best we can." Even Adam Smith designed our system so that our vices, our inherent desire to serve ourselves and benefit ourselves, can be made to serve others. For example, you start a business. And you start that business because you want to make a lot of money, you want to be rich, you want to be wealthy. But to do that, your business has to produce products that are of high quality so that you can build for yourself a name brand, like Apple, for example, right? And once you get a strong name brand, you make quality products, the brand sells itself. So your desire to become wealthy requires that you produce quality products that then benefit others. And in that respect, your vices can be made to serve and benefit others. The unconstrained vision, which you might say aligns with the left and the progressives, is that man may not be perfect, but through redesigning the systems of economics and of government, and through continued refinement, we can begin to make man ever so more perfectible. He won't reach perfection, but certainly we can trend towards that over time. They don't see human nature as fixed. Rather, they believe that what we call human nature is a reality, just a product of the social conditions and the systems in which an individual is born into that make them that way. So if you can change the system, the government, the economies, the context, then you can change what man is. In other words, they see man as a tabula rasa, right? You're born as a blank slate, and then it's just a matter of what you craft into or how you refine that blank slate to get the end product. In the constrained vision, everything's about trade-offs. In other words, the solution, the cure, might be worse than the actual disease. The unconstrained vision believes that there are no social ills that cannot be solved through better governments and economic systems. I remember reading in a book called The Logic of Failure, originally written in German, translated to English. And in it, the author gives a story. And I don't remember if the story is apocryphal or not, but it was to demonstrate what he was talking about. So in it, a group of Europeans go to Africa, and their desire is to make life better there for the indigenous population of a particular African country. And because of the high rates of sickness and illness, they thought, well, if we can improve the quality of water, this will drastically decrease in the amount of sicknesses and diseases spreading throughout these various villages. So they drill deep down and start producing high quality water. And sure enough, the sicknesses and disease go away. Then after about 20 years, suddenly the wells go empty. All right, they've pumped up all the water. There's no water left. And now all of a sudden you have massive starvation. You have a much larger population. These villages begin to collapse because all the drinking water is now gone. And you have a massive population that's much bigger than it otherwise would have been. So the question becomes, have more social ills been caused by men, by good men, trying to achieve noble aims, or by evil men intent on such ends? And that's really what, when we look at communism specifically, and to a lesser degree perhaps socialism, those are systems designed to eliminate inequality, right? That's the purpose of them, to redistribute wealth. The purpose of these systems is to redistribute wealth and eliminate inequality. Yet, in pursuit of these noble aims, getting back to what the Constrained Vision put forth, that sometimes the solution or the cure, the remedy, is worse than the disease itself. In this pursuit, you ended up killing, especially under communism, vast swaths of your population. So, for example, get ready to count. Under communism, roughly 1 million people in Vietnam died, roughly 1.7 in Africa, 2 million in Cambodia, 2 million in North Korea, 20 to 60 million in Russia, 60 to 100 million in China. Think about that. You could take the First and Second World War, multiply it by 2, and still fall well short of the cost of implementing communism across the world. And these were systems designed to eliminate inequality. And yet they resulted in massive death on a scale unimaginable. So both socialism and communism aim at public rather than individual ownership of the means and distribution of goods. They both kind of grew out of response to the Industrial Revolution, which happens between the 1760s and like the 1840s, and then there's a second Industrial Revolution in the later 19th century. But here's the thing. So for much of human history, think about it this way. You woke up when the sun rose, you went and worked out on your farm, you worked it with your family, your kids, your wife, and then when the sun went down, you went back home. You had dinner together, you lived together, you were your own master, you worked for yourself, and it was a tough life, but it was your own. With the Industrial Revolution, you have mass movement of populations going from rural to urban, right? You're going from your farms and you're moving into the city. And then you're going to start working in these factories. And working in these factories during the first Industrial Revolution and even the second, but certainly the first, was not a pleasant thing. It was miserable working. You worked long hours, 18 hours a day, getting paid pennies on the dollar, and you had enough money at the end of the day for food or maybe for some shelter, but not enough for both. There were no laws against child labor. There was no laws against you being cheated out of your wages. It was incredibly difficult. There was no one to appeal to. There was no union. The government really didn't get involved too much. And so you had no recourse. And now instead of working for yourself and going through the natural rhythms of life being governed by the rising and the setting of the sun and by the rhythms of the season, now everything's very mechanical. You know, you wake up at a particular time when the clock goes off, you go and you work in these factories for somebody else, you don't get paid any money, you're probably not working with your family anymore. There are people that see this. Marx sees what's going on with the Industrial Revolution, how people are taking advantage of, and he says, I'm going to design a better system. And he casts his eyes over history. And what he sees, he comes up with an economic interpretation of history through various stages as it evolves. But by and large, there are two classes of people. There is the proletariat, which means without property. You're like the worker. And there's the bourgeoisie, which is like the capitalist or the business owner. And so what he believes is happening here, the worker is doing all the work, and yet it's the business owner who's making all the money and getting rich. So the real question for Marx is, who owns the means of production and who should own it? Well, right now, it's the bourgeoisie. They own the means of production. But it really should be the worker. So he envisions a revolution, a violent revolution, where the worker overthrows the worker, the proletariat, overthrows the bourgeoisie, the business owner. So Marx sees some economic systems throughout history. So we'll start with feudalism. From feudalism, you then go to capitalism. From capitalism to socialism. From socialism to communism. Now, there's been no end of confusion about the difference between socialism and communism. And we'll get into what socialism is today, because even in Marx's and Engels' own writings, they often interchange these terms. What is certain is that Marx saw socialism as an intermediate step before you reach communism. In this process that we see taking place, in the end, when we reach communism, you will have a society that is stateless, that is propertyless, that is moneyless, and classless. In other words, it becomes kind of heaven on earth, and rather everybody shares equally in what is produced. In fact, under communism, it's from each according to their ability to each according to their need. In other words, you produce as best you can based on your ability, and then you receive based on your needs. Socialism is different. It's from each according to their ability to each according to their labor. So under socialism, you do get some differences. There is some reward for your labor. So this is one of the problems that socialism and communism have. How do you motivate people to take risks and put forth their best effort when they're not going to be rewarded based on their effort? Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned and regulated by the community as a whole. Communism is a social, political, and economic theory structured upon the ideas of common ownership of the means of production and the absence of social classes, money, and the state. Okay, so under socialism, you get to own property. There isn't the elimination of class, and there isn't the elimination of money, and often there is a democratically elected government. Under communism, you have a strong central government, and you aim at the elimination of the state, classes, private property, and money. In practice, there is very little difference between the two. The left will tell you there's never been a purely socialist or a purely communist state, but we've seen them in practice in many countries, and they all look about the same. One of the things you'll often hear when people talk about socialism and communism is, well, they just haven't been implemented correctly. They haven't been tried right. But in places that have practiced communism and or socialism, the results are often the same. So this is what it looks like. So in both socialism and communism, the government owns the means and distribution of production. So what does that mean? Let's say it's 1930, you live in Russia, and they decide to take away private property, and instead you have these collective farms. So rather than you owning your personal farm, what happens is we've taken a bunch of these smaller farms and we just made one large farm in this particular region. And then you and your neighbors are all going to work together to work this farm. Then, this is the means of production, right? You're going to go out there, you're going to plant, you're going to harvest. Then you're going to take the harvest, it's going to be refined somewhere else at a plant, and then the government is going to distribute it. And then they're all going to give you the same amount of money. That's how it works. But what happens in practice is the government takes all of the food, you get very little, they pay you next to nothing, and then maybe you did a lot more work than your neighbor who happens to be a bit more lazy. They get paid the same as you. So the next year comes around and you go back to planting, harvesting, refining, and distributing the goods. And what you find is, well, what's my incentive to work very hard? Well, you don't have one. And so we see both this in Soviet Russia and in Maoist China. You have these massive collectivist farms with the same results, massive starvation. Then when you look at some of the socialist states around today, like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, you see a very similar trend. Again, the government owns the means and distribution of production. And you have massive inefficiency throughout the entire system, and it breaks down. Now, Venezuela has some complicating factors, but nevertheless, part of the problem is the socialism that they're practicing there. It just doesn't work. So then you have these Nordic states which have implemented a hybrid system, right? You have a capitalist economy paired with a welfare state, because you need a capitalist economy to produce the wealth, because socialist systems and communist systems economics don't produce any wealth. The capitalist economy produces a lot of wealth, which then you can tax heavily to support your welfare state. In fact, Sweden is often more economically free than we are in the United States. They have no minimum wage, they have no wealth tax, they have low corporate taxes, you can hire and fire for any reason, but they do have a high tax rate. They have something called a VAT, value added tax, which is 25%. But to promote economic productivity, what they do is they give you an incentive as an individual. In fact, I believe Sweden per capita has more millionaires than we do in the United States. And here's the reason. Even though they have a very high tax rate, on average around 50% up to like 70%, but they have a low corporate tax rate. So what this promotes in Sweden is if you want to be wealthy, then you start your own business. But their system is set up in such a way as to promote those capitalistic tendencies so that you're rewarded for your labor and for your effort. You don't get those under the classical socialist systems that we see like in Venezuela, where the government owns the economic means of production as well. Also in Sweden, they don't demonize the rich. There's no class warfare going on. In fact, no matter how rich you are or how poor you are, college is free. Healthcare is free. In other words, it's not means tested, it's universal. Everybody pays a hefty amount of taxes, but everybody benefits. Furthermore, in Sweden, they have a school voucher system. The government gives you a check and you can take your student to anywhere that you want. So you have AOC and Bernie Sanders talking about democratic socialism, which is socialism, the failed socialism that we've been talking about. And so when you look around the world to see the places where this has been practiced, it's failed everywhere it's been used, which is why we see these Scandinavian countries like in Sweden, where they employ capitalism as their economic model, which then they tax heavily to support their welfare state. If you've been watching news lately, you probably think that inequality is a product of capitalist systems and that when you have these more socialist and communist systems, the inequality goes away. Well, that's just not true at all. So I got here a book, The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. Now in it, he goes all the way back thousands of years, all the way back to hunter-gatherers. And what he finds is, so with these hunter-gatherers, when they go back and they open up these burial sites, what they find is that most people aren't buried with much of anything, right? It's just their bones. What you find when you open up these tombs of these chiefs is, well, there's large amounts of high quality, whether it's gold or silver or their swords or their axes, that they're buried with significant wealth, while the vast majority of people buried or graves that are found have nothing. So even going all the way back to hunter-gatherers, before we even have socialism, capitalism, and communism, monarchies, whatever form of government you're talking about, there's been inequality. In fact, in The Great Leveler, he says, there's been inequality in every form of government, in every system throughout time. There's always been some degree of inequality. What we're finding is that no matter what system of government you have, inequality begins to develop. This is described as the Pareto distribution, the 80-20 principle. And this is that 80% of your results come from 20% of your effort. Pareto distribution throughout just about anything in life. If you look at cities, well, in the United States, 80% of the population or 83% of the population lives in cities. 8 out of the 10 biggest cities in the world are on the coast. Publications. If you take my history department, most people have 0 or 1 or 2 books. And then there's some outliers that produce dozens of books, a dozen plus books. If you look at sales, you'll find the same thing. You have your workforce, but the vast proportion of your selling probably comes from a handful of people. I have an uncle that's a realtor, right? Been highly successful. And he's told me the same things. The vast proportion of your sales will come from a small group of people. Inequality is a huge problem because if it becomes too great, it destabilizes society. Really, the great levelers, right? The things that eliminate inequality are like war and plague. But what's the advantage there? We're all miserable together. Inequality is a problem, and you have to find ways to minimize it. But some of these systems, like with socialism and communism, they have done the exact opposite of produce wealth and equality. Rather, they produce vast inequality. The Pareto distribution is also seen within socialism and communism. Rather, the means of production and the distribution of goods being held communally under socialism or by the state under communism, what ends up happening is, as power is consolidated, so is wealth. And that's why you see vast inequality in these socialist and communist systems. Look at Venezuela. The rich are still rich there. Under communism, well, the ruling elites are still the ones that are wealthy, and all the peasants are still dirt poor. So these systems predicated upon and designed to eliminate inequality actually produced even more inequality, and on top of that, massive death in the tens of millions. Now I know what you really want to do is you want to hit that like and subscribe button and leave a comment down below.